And so they're tweeting out things like, you know, it's fine to be against the COVID. Here it is. The MMR vaccine is very effective at preventing measles. It does not cause autism. In 2019, after plummeting vaccine rates, the Samoa measles outbreak killed 83 of 5,697 infected. He's making these statements because he's trying to say COVID vaccine bad, childhood vaccine good. It's okay, Martin, I get it. You have never really done any investigation into this. This is a part of the orthodoxy you've been a part of. It's really hard to let go of it, but this is the work that we do. I'm about to show you a brand new, we just released a press release. And by the way, if you were just simply a member of our newsletter, which all you have to do right now is just go down on the page at the Highwire and just type in your email. And now you'll be sent every time there's a breaking news story, a legal story, or if you just want all of the facts that we've delivered on our show today, on Monday, you get every piece of evidence we have, every study that McCullough talks about, the entire study is in your hands. You get to have the evidence in your hands. We're calling it the Highwire Protocol, total transparency in journalism. We want everyone else to do it. But if you aren't a part of our newsletter, then you're not a part of that process. You are not helping us advance how news should be happening. Now, what you will find out is today we took the Catherine Edwards, let me, hold on here. I got a giant book to explain this to you. This is the Bible on vaccines, Plotkin on vaccine, Plotkin's vaccines. Now, we have a total deposition, complete deposition of Stanley Plotkin, the godfather of vaccines. But look at the other names up there, and you will find that Catherine Edwards is a part of this. In fact, she's the godmother of the vaccine program. There's barely a vaccine on the schedule for children that she wasn't a part of the clinical trials. I've told you before, when you're donating to the Highwire, part of what you're doing is helping, you know, nearly half of the proceeds that come in go to our legal work, to sue the CDC, FDA, to get involved in personal cases. We stopped the Washington, D.C. minor consent for vaccine bill where they were trying to allow children to vaccinate themselves without parental approval. We broke that law and shut it down. Fighting for the military. We had a huge show about that. Just go back and watch the show right before the holidays. But what I want to say is this. One of the things we do is Aaron Siri is by far, I think, the most talented lawyer when it comes to doing depositions and doing cross-examinations of science and specifically vaccine specialists. So there was a case about autism, and a child that got autism, as they believe, right after vaccination. And Catherine Edwards was brought in as the specialist to say that that's not true. Now, if you're brand new, this is why I'm sharing with you, you're probably asking, well, there's the COVID vaccine. What about the childhood vaccines? They've been tested, correctly, right? Well, this is what they tell us. The studies have been done. We know, just as Martin Coulter so confidently said, vaccines don't cause autism. The science has been done. Well, while she was on the stand, Aaron Siri got into that exact question in this case that happened in Tennessee. You are going to have, by the way, we just posted on our website hours and hours of both the cross-examination, which you're about to watch, the deposition, which happened over Zoom, and then the cross-examination, which happened in a courtroom. Here's how you do it. Just go to the Highwire. You just go down and click on, I guess they call it the hamburger there, the I Can Legal. Click on that. Boom, that button takes you to, you've got the Stanley Plotkin depositions there, but now we also have the Catherine Edwards cross-examinations. But thehighwire.com/ICANLegal will also get you there very easily. Okay, this is just a couple minutes because this is so revealing, and this this is important to everybody that has a child. Everyone that's ever been a part of this vaccine program, get ready for what I think is, again, one of the most important depositions ever done. Listen to this.
If you're going to design a clinical trial of a vaccine given to children 18 months or younger, how long would that clinical trial need to be to determine whether the vaccine caused autism?
In general, the autism is generally diagnosed somewhere within the first couple years of life. And I think maybe the mean time is about 2 years, depending upon the severity. So I think that however, I think that most of the going theories would suggest that autism is really a prenatal event and not an event that happens after the child is born. So I think that what you're asking me is a little bit of a loaded question, so I will ask you, or I will answer in that that the vaccine trials that are conducted always have a tail of about a year that is required for the manufacturers to follow the patients.
For the vaccines licensed, by the year 2000, how many children would you estimate need to be in those clinical trials to detect whether the vaccine caused autism by 8 to 18 months, and how long would the trial need to continue after 18 months of age?
I can't give you those numbers off the top of my head, exactly how they would be. I think that I think one of the, when you have a rare event, although, autism is now felt to be about 1.5% of the population, when you have a rare event, and particularly when it might have been more difficult to diagnose earlier, in an earlier time, then I think it takes larger numbers, but I can't give you that number, sir.
Now remember, she is involved in designing the trials and being a part of the trials for the vaccine program as we know it. She is literally at the top of the field. But let me explain to you, for those of you that we do get in the weeds on this show, we are not going to just try and zip through this. I want you to understand what's happening here. Here is the question. Autism is said to be very rare. She says it's about 1.5% of the population, so 1.5 people out of 100. Remember, back in the 1960s, 70s, autism was said to be 1 in 10,000. We are now inside of 1 in 100, okay, as far as she's admitting to, but the data, that's not even actually accurate. If you look at the national data, we have some of it here. They say the U.S. autism rate is 1 in 44. However, the New Jersey rate, where they do better record keeping, is 1 in 35 among 8-year-old children. And so by 8 years old is usually when you've collected all those that would have autism. They're at 1 in 35. And look at this, boys with ASD outnumber girls 4.2 to 1. You can only imagine the math. In my head, I can't, but if we're at 1 in 33 and it's 4 times more prevalent in boys, you're talking 1 in 18 boys, 1 in 20 boys, somewhere in there, for you mathematicians out there, is being diagnosed with autism in the United States of America, up from 1 in 10,000. So now the question is, when you, Catherine Edwards, are here on the stand or are planning to be on the stand and say that vaccines don't cause autism, what was the size of the trial that you did to determine that? And how long was it? These are the 2 questions he's bringing her. Because if, let's say 1 in 33, let's say roughly 3 out of 100 would get autism in a vaccine trial, how many would we need in the placebo group and in the vaccine group in order to determine with statistical significance that it is being caused by the vaccine? Now, she says, I don't know the number, and I don't either. I'm not a specialist. I would say thousands. In fact, I would say if you did a study like Moderna had with 30,000 people for the coronavirus vaccine, or Pfizer had 46,000 people, half of which got the placebo and the other half got the vaccine, that would about do it. That would about do it. And if the timeline, and by the way, how many were in the most recent MMR that we give our kids, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine? Less than 1,000. Not 30,000 like Moderna, not, 46,000. So Martin Koldorf, when you're like, I hate the COVID vaccine trials, but I love the childhood vaccine. Really? Really? Because I would have dreamed that the MMR got that many people in a trial. But here's the issue. So you don't have enough kids in the trial to determine whether there's a statistical problem or not. And now what about the duration? How long did you track them? Because if autism only appears after vaccination, as she said, usually in about 2 years, but honestly, we don't fully get the full group till about 8 years old. You would have to imagine this trial would have to be at least 4 years long if you're going to rule out the potential for a vaccine to cause autism. Well, with MMR, how long was the trial? Guess what? It wasn't 4 years. It wasn't 4 months. It was 42 days with less than 1,000 kids. This is the problem, Martin Koldorf. This is the problem with this ideology. The trials haven't been done. The question is Aaron Siri talented enough to get this person who knows exactly what he's trying to get out of her to admit you never did the proper trials to be able to make that statement? Can he do it? Just watch.
Given what you know about clinical trials, would you agree with me that the clinical trials relied upon to license the vaccines given for Yates were not designed to determine whether these products cause autism when given to an infant or toddler at or below the age of 18 months?
I think those trials were likely not powered to answer that question. I don't recall the actual number that were enrolled in the MMR vaccine trials, and so I can't say that definitively. But I would trust that it likely was not large enough, and that's why large database studies are needed to really assess that in a phase 4 assessment.
So it sounds like you would agree there weren't. They probably, as you said, are unlikely to be improperly powered, and they would have needed to review safety long enough as well to determine, to capture enough children in the experimental and control group that had or didn't have autism in order to make an assessment of whether the product caused autism, correct?
Yes, sir. If an adverse event were to occur associated with vaccines, that if it were an uncommon event and if it was not diagnosed until later, then you would need a larger number of sample size and a longer period to assess that. I am not saying, however, by answering yes to your questions that I believe that vaccines cause autism. So I just want to make sure that you understand what I'm saying.
Never asked that question. Absolutely. I think the record's clear on that. How long would safety have to be tracked in the clinical trials relied upon to license the vaccines Yates received in order for them to have determined whether the vaccine caused autism?
Object to form the question. You may answer, doctor, if you have the answer.
I'm not going to answer it. I've already answered the question.
I don't recall that you have not provided any period of time. Are you saying you don't know the period of time? Please.
I said that the studies that were involved in the licensure of MMR did not provide an adequate number of patients that had been followed for 4 years to determine a rare event that would happen 4 years after vaccination. That's what I'm saying.
According to your profile, you have done most of the pivotal trials relied upon to license many of the vaccines, correct, on the market?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So you're highly experienced at conducting clinical trials, correct?
I'm highly experienced conducting clinical trials.
Okay. And you're familiar with many of the clinical trials that relied upon to license many of the vaccines currently on the market, correct?
I am.
Okay. In your opinion, did the clinical trials relied upon to license the vaccines that Yates received, many of which are still on the market today, were they designed to rule out that the vaccine causes autism?
No. You've badgered me into answering the question the way you want me to, but I think that that's probably the answer.
Is that your accurate and truthful testimony?
Yes.
Thank you.
I don't know. I hope you don't have to be a geek to really get into that. I mean, that is absolutely stunning. And by the way, the footage we put up is the raw footage. It is unedited. We cut that down. That's about, I don't know, 20 minutes, 30 minutes of Erin having to work her into that position where she finally just gives up the ghost and tells the truth. And so we're going to continue to edit pieces of that. But it's all a part of what ICANN does. We send Aaron in. We sent them for weeks to be a part of this case and funded that to happen so that we can now have this as evidence for newspapers and news agencies. And we hope that other groups write about this incredible deposition, because that's how change is made. And we hope that Rand Paul gets a chance to see it. And by the way, take these clips as we make them and send them to your representatives and say, this is why I want you to end mandates. Vaccine mandates cannot happen under this wishful thinking type of science that's going on. It does not work. And by the way, I want liability back on the manufacturers. If the FDA and this head, is going to be a part of our regulatory agencies, then no liability protection. Let's see how many MMR vaccines we're all forced to take when all liability for injury, when we finally maybe do a study, like she said, should be done in the databases of the world, which, by the way, the CDC has refused to do the comparative vaccinated versus unvaccinated study we've been asking for a long time. She said that'd be the only way you would know. And here it is, folks. Not a single one of the childhood vaccines that are in your children's schedule, they're all right there. None of them was ever tested against the saline placebo. So Moderna's COVID vaccine, saline placebo, because we've threatened to sue, they actually changed that. Same thing with Pfizer, but not in your childhood vaccines. No saline placebo, no long-term study that went beyond 6 months. And by the way, ultimately never enough kids in order to see the issues that we're seeing skyrocket all through our population. So we're going to continue to bring you more and more information throughout the year, because so many of you are brand new to this. Many of us need to revisit this, because now that we watch COVID happen right before our eyes, a lot of this is going to make a lot more sense to you. This is how it's always been done. Nothing against these guys, but I just want to point out that this is a lot of the conversation that's happening right now.
There's been a tremendous loss of trust in public health, and I think you can see that in the decreased uptake of vaccines that have been traditionally used in other states. This isn't just anti-vax people. This is people who've really lost trust in the system, and I think in order to restore that, you have to restore that trust to get those people to believe in the efficacy of these vaccines that have been used for decades without problem and that have been very effective.
The other vaccines actually are quite effective, quite safe. The fact that the public health authorities in the United States have destroyed confidence in public health should not extend to the other vaccines as well.
The people who said that everybody should get vaccinated are just as unscientifically wrong as the people who say that nobody should have vaccines. So we have to try to get away from these two extremes.
Do not take this information that we are saying here about the COVID vaccines and spread that across all of these other vaccines that we've been giving with very, very nearly no side effects. We have 1 in a million. Okay, these are safe. 1 in a million, that is an incredibly rare side effect. So please, parents, do not spread this into other vaccines that have been used safely.
Well, this is why we've created a new segment for our show called It Ain't Just the COVID Vax. This is our wheelhouse. This is what we've done. If you've been following us before COVID, you know all of the work we did both legally and as reporters and in our investigations into the safety and efficacy of vaccines. Last week, we played you one of the installments of the Catherine Edwards deposition. Remember, we send Aaron Siri out because you are funding the ability for us to say in cases that aren't even our cases, but they're going to have a world-renowned scientist like Catherine Edwards, who literally wrote the book on vaccinations along with Stanley Plotkin, somebody else Aaron has deposed. But we are able to say, Aaron, we will pay to have you go and get involved in the depositions, because no one is better at getting the truth from scientists than Aaron Siri is. And so we played you a clip. I'm going to play you a clip in a second, but I want to give it some context, because it's really this interaction that you have as those that are supporting the work we're doing, what you are making possible, because it all builds on itself. It builds on this library of information we now have that Neil deGrasse Tyson doesn't have, and many of the scientists who I'm fans of the work that they have done, but they don't know their space here. But let's get to it. This idea, that vaccines are safe and the MMR is safe and all this, and especially is always this really pesky conversation about autism. Do vaccines cause autism? In fact, when you go to the CDC's website, which you'll do if you get a VIS, a vaccine information sheet you're handed when you're supposed to give your child a vaccination, that's all of your informed consent. You're supposed to be told all of the benefits and potential side effects, but they hand you the sheet. Most times they hand you the sheet after you already got the vaccine on your way out the door, which is actually a violation of the Nuremberg Code. But whatever, the sheet basically says you might have some swelling in the arm and some other things. If you really want to know about other side effects, then go to this website. When you go to that website, this is what pops up in the headline. Vaccines do not cause autism. I mean, it's really weird because you didn't even ask that question. This is literally the top of the page about vaccine harms. And you just want to know what potential harms are out there. They go out of their way to start the conversation with vaccines do not cause autism. So, in the way that we do, we asked Aaron Siri, would you please, and look, there's a lot of weird studies that were done on MMR vaccine, which is given at 2 years old, and you could get into thimerosal. So we wanted to say vaccines. That means every vaccine. You're pretty sure that every vaccine doesn't cause autism. So we said, let's bring a lawsuit about the vaccines we've never talked about, the ones given in the first 6 months of life. If you look at the CDC schedule, it looks something like this. These are the hepatitis B, the rotavirus, the diphtheria, the Haemophilus influenza, pneumococcal, inactivated poliovirus, and influenza. And look at that. Many of those are on their third dose by the time you're at 6 months. You could be somewhere in the neighborhood of 20-something vaccines inside of your kid within that first 6 months, which is more than any adult ever got back before this program was liability protected. But that's a totally different story. So let's get to it. So we said, we would like, and this is a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request. Remember, the government works for us. So we said, will you please provide us with all the studies and trials that you rely upon when we're discussing the vaccines in the first 6 months of life, the ones I just listed, that make you feel comfortable with the scientific statement that none of them cause autism? Well, obviously, they didn't answer us the way they usually do, and then they pushed back, and we kept resubmitting and finally said, we're going to sue you, and we did sue them. We sued them and brought them to court, and the judge says, what's going on here? Why will you not just answer this FOIA request? And they're like, well, because we don't really want to. He's like, well, you have to, and so they did. They ultimately, after a long, fought-out battle, ended up saying, okay, here's the studies we relied upon for those first 6 vaccines. I named them all. You saw them. It was about 20 studies. And in those 20 studies, it sort of breaks down like this. You had one of them that was about the MMR. We didn't ask about the MMR, so that didn't work. One was about MMR and DTaP vaccine. So DTaP was on the list, and I'll get back to that. MMR and thimerosal. Thimerosal is the mercury-containing preservative in vaccines, so they did separate studies on just the mercury, but there was no mercury in the first 6 months of vaccines that we were talking about. And then there's all these just thimerosal studies about mercury. And then lastly, there's one study on antigens, which we never asked about and really isn't about vaccines, about total amount of antigens in vaccines, high antigen vaccines against low antigen vaccines, not our question, and still not the vaccines we're asking about. So what's really ironic is of all the studies they showed us, of all the vaccines that we asked about, only one contained one of the vaccines that we asked about, and that was the DTaP vaccine. They had nothing on the rest. So when you look at that one study that they sent us saying, see, we did look into one of the vaccines you're asking about, it's in this. This was a study done by the Institute of Medicine on adverse effects of vaccines, and this is what it says about its investigation of the DTaP vaccine. Conclusion: the evidence is inadequate to accept or reject a causal relationship between diphtheria toxoid, tetanus toxoid, or acellular pertussis, that's the DTaP, containing vaccines and autism. It's also the DTP or TDAP, any version of that. In fact, they said no studies really exist, but there was one study that they did look at. So there was one study, and this is what they said. The committee reviewed one study to evaluate the risk of autism after the administration of DTaP vaccine. It's the only study on the planet that actually exists. This one study by Geyer and Geyer was not considered in the weight of epidemiologic evidence because it provided data from a passive surveillance system and lacked an unvaccinated comparison population, meaning it didn't have a placebo group. It was using VAERS, our only reporting system, which we don't trust. There you have it. But that's all they had. They literally put in the one study that made our point. You never looked at this. You've never looked at this. But this is how this works. So once we won that, now we get to go into courtrooms and challenge scientific professionals that write the book on vaccines, literally, and say, well, what do you have to say about this? You know, we're just waiting to see if they try to lie because we now have CDC confirmed court-won evidence you never did the proper studies. This is this week's piece of the deposition of Catherine Edwards, one of the leading scientific officials on vaccinations. Grab some popcorn. Here we go.
There are a number of peer-reviewed studies that have looked at and surveyed parents with autistic children with regards to what they blame as a cause of their child's autism, correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And many of those studies have come back with results that show that a significant proportion of parents with autistic children continue to blame vaccines as a potential cause of their child's autism, correct?
Okay. Object to the form of the question.
That is correct.
Now, in the expert disclosures for this case, it asserts that, among other things, you will testify that, quote, the issue of whether vaccines cause autism has been thoroughly researched and rejected, end quote. Let me ask you, do you believe the issue of whether vaccines cause autism has been thoroughly researched and rejected?
Yes, sir, I do.
Okay. You have also repeatedly provided interviews in which you stated categorically that vaccines do not cause autism, correct?
That's correct.
When you made those statements, did you mean that no vaccines cause autism?
That's correct.
So it is your testimony that none of the vaccines that you received can cause autism?
That's correct.
Okay. It's your testimony that MMR vaccine cannot cause autism?
That's correct.
It's your testimony that Hep B vaccine cannot cause autism?
That's correct.
It's your testimony that iPol cannot cause autism?
Yes.
It's your testimony that HIV vaccine cannot cause autism?
Yes.
It's your testimony that varicella vaccine cannot cause autism?
Yes.
It's your testimony that Prevnar vaccine cannot cause autism?
Yes.
And it's your testimony that DTaP vaccine cannot cause autism?
Yes.
And do you have a study that supports that DTaP doesn't cause autism?
I do not have a study that DTaP causes autism. So I don't have either.
Do you have any study one way or another of whether iPol causes autism?
No, I do not, sir.
Do you have any study one way or another of whether NGRX B causes autism?
I do not have any evidence that it causes autism, nor that it does not.
And what about HIV titers vaccine? Any evidence one way or another of whether it causes autism?
No.
And what about Prevnar vaccine? Any evidence one way or another?
No, sir. No, sir.
And how about varicella vaccine? Let me just finish. Are there any studies one way or another that support whether it does or doesn't cause autism?
Part of MMR, but not as varicella by itself. No, sir. No studies that say it does, or no studies that say it doesn't.
Right. There have been studies that have found an association between hepatitis B vaccine and autism, correct?
Not studies that I feel are credible.
Okay, which study are you referring to when you say that?
Well, why don't you show me the study and then I'll see whether I agree with it.
Folks, this is a part of you, and there's so many of you that I know are new to this show because of the COVID vaccine, and you're a little bit dismayed at what you just saw take place with the trials of the COVID vaccine, and there's not enough Neil deGrasse Tysons in the world to talk you into the fact that it would be a good idea to take it. But I have news for you. We have done years and years of investigation of the entire vaccine program, and frankly, COVID vaccine is one of the best tested. It's a horrible safety test, but that's how these are all done. And what you are seeing is what this really is. What Neil deGrasse Tyson is showing you, and the scientists that were appearing in Florida on that panel, which is we have just a simple religion of wishful thinking that exists. I will state that none of these vaccines cause autism, yet I cannot point to a single study that can back up that claim. And by the way, when we have demanded, when every parent of an autistic child has demanded, will you just look in the database? In fact, Bobby Kennedy and I appeared for Donald Trump at the National Institute of Health to have this conversation. We said to Tony Fauci, who was sitting right across from me, Francis Collins right across from me, and a whole host of other scientists, will you please just do a retrospective study using your VSD database that has the health records of over 10 million people, tens of thousands of them are unvaccinated. All this has been investigated. Just compare the two groups and ask questions like, which group, the vaccinated or the completely unvaccinated, have more autism? And you know what they said? We will never do that study. This is the world as we know it. This is the faith Neil deGrasse Tyson and these other scientists have. It's just faith. It's a religion. And why won't they do that study? Perhaps the best it's ever been stated is why one of the greatest world-renowned scientists who ran the National Institute of Health for the United States of America, I'm talking about Bernardine Healy. Before Francis Collins, she was the world-leading scientist running the NIH. And this is what she said honestly about the conversation of vaccines and autism.
This is the time when we do have the opportunity to understand whether or not there are susceptible children, perhaps genetically, perhaps they have a metabolic issue, mitochondrial disorder, immunological issue, that makes them more susceptible to vaccines, plural, or to one particular vaccine, or to a component of vaccine, like mercury. The fact that there is concern that you don't want to know that susceptible group is a real disappointment to me. If you know that susceptible group, you can save those children. The reason why they didn't want to look for those susceptibility groups was because they're afraid that if they found them, however big or small they were, that would scare the public away.
It sounds like you don't think the hypothesis of a link between vaccines and autism is completely irrational.
So when I first heard about it, I thought, well, that doesn't make sense to me. The more you delve into it, if you look at the basic science, if you look at the research that's been done in animals, if you also look at some of these individual cases, and if you look at the evidence that there is no link, what I come away with is the question has not been answered.
There you have it. There you have it. The question has not been answered by one of the world's leading scientists. They refuse to do the proper studies. Why? Because they are so petrified that even if they see a small group that is having this issue with vaccines, that will scare the public. I mean, doesn't matter, whatever you think, maybe that's true. Maybe we are so reactive that we would overreact or whatever the concern is. But what she's giving you is the motive for the biggest lie ever told and why science isn't doing its job. They're terrified to do the right job. And now we have seen one of the greatest declines in our children's health ever recorded, especially when it comes to autism. It used to be 1 in 10,000 were being diagnosed in the 1970s. And because of these mute scientists that are afraid to look at what they're doing, it has been a 241% increase. And now the CDC admits to 1 in 44 children. New Jersey has it about 1 in 33 because they track it better, 1 in 35. I'm sorry. And then ultimately, it's 4 times more prevalent in boys, 4.2 times more prevalent. So that means if you just isolated boys, we are looking at somewhere around 1 in 18 to 1 in 20 are being diagnosed in the United States of America. This is a pandemic. This is one of the worst pandemics that has ever happened.
Dr. Plotkin, has there ever been a study which looked at the total health outcomes of children following the CDC's vaccination schedule and those who are completely unvaccinated, such as Faith?
Not that I'm aware of.
It is my great honor to use the Stanley Plotkin gavel to open this meeting.
It's our good friend and colleague, Dr. Stan Plotkin.
Dr. Plotkin. Virtually every country in the world is affected by his vaccines.
He was involved in pivotal trials on anthrax, oral polio, rabies vaccine,
rubella vaccine, the rotavirus vaccine, rabies.
He has earned the Distinguished Physician Award of the Pediatric Infectious Disease Society, the Finland Award of the National Foundation for Infectious Diseases, the Hilleman Award of the American Society for Microbiology, the French Legion of Honor, and the Bruce Medal in Preventive Medicine.
He's a member of the Institute of Medicine and the French Academy of Medicine.
One of the very special things about him is the global impact that he's had, not just from the products, but from his book.
He developed the standard textbook for vaccines in 1988.
Bill Gates calls his book a Bible for vaccinologists.
I hope you all have indeed have read the book, and I hope it's more accurate than the Bible.
He trained just a generation of scientists, including myself, to think like he thinks.
Dr. Plotkin, has there ever been a study which looked at the total health outcomes of children following the CDC's vaccination schedule and those who are completely unvaccinated, such as Faith?
Not that I'm aware of.
Why has that study not been done?
Probably because it is considered bad malpractice not to vaccinate a child.
So you're saying a prospective study might be improper because it will leave a child unvaccinated?
Correct.
Okay. What about a retrospective study?
That, I suppose, could be done, but it wouldn't be randomized.
You're familiar with the Vaccine Safety Data Link?
Yes.
Are you aware that there are a few thousand children that are, my understanding, completely unvaccinated in the VSD?
Oh, I don't doubt it.
Okay. Couldn't the Vaccine Safety Data Link be used to conduct a retrospective vaccinated versus unvaccinated study to look for health outcomes?
Well, I don't know. Theoretically, perhaps, but one would have to be convinced that the children were comparable in other ways besides being vaccinated or unvaccinated.
Okay. Every time you do a retrospective study, that you always need to control for potential co-founders, correct?
Correct.
And that's what you're talking about, controlling for co-founders, right?
Yes.
The CDC, pharma, they conduct studies all the time, right?
Yes.
Yes, including studies that have co-founders that need to be controlled for, right?
Yes, they try, yes.
Vaccine studies, especially for efficacy, happen all the time, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Plotkin, I'm going to hand you what's being marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 23. Whoops, I'm sorry. Dr. Plotkin, what's an ICD-9 code?
Well, it's essentially a way of coding diseases usually for remuneration purposes.
Okay. So when a doctor administers a drug or diagnoses as a patient or something similar, there's a code that they would enter into the system, right?
Yes.
And the ICD-9 codes are published by the American Medical Association, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So if you go to the second page, do you see there's a code V64.07?
Yes.
What is that code for?
Vaccination not carried out for religious reasons.
Okay. So wouldn't it be feasible, for example, to compare children who have this coding, who are not being vaccinated, with those who are being vaccinated, who are in similar communities, have similar demographics, and otherwise avoid as much as possible other potential co-founders?
Well, if you could eliminate the co-founders, it would be feasible.
Can you tell me a co-founder that's not easy to control for?
In principle, one can control for any confounding problem. The issue would be just how many there are and just how large a group you would need for statistical significance. See, that's another issue. I mean, we accept as a valid conclusion something that is false 5 times out of 100. And so not only do we have to try to eliminate confounders, but we also need repetition of studies to be sure that the results we got in the first study were not in the 5 studies that were false in their conclusion.
But
so you would need multiple studies.
Okay. And since these are retrospective, they're really just running data, right?
If the data are encoded, yes.
Okay. So I asked earlier, what co-founder can you list that's not easy to control for? And I did not hear another co-founder. Can you tell me a co-founder in this proposed study that would not be easy to control for?
Exposure would be probably the most difficult. In other words, whether a child is living in a community where exposure to disease is rare or absent, or whether a child is living in a community where there are significant possibilities of exposure. I think that would be probably the most difficult to account for.
When's the last case of polio in the United States, wild polio?
Oh, I forget the exact year, but it's been probably 20, 25 years.
Would 1979 sound correct to you?
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah. So that wouldn't be an issue, correct?
No, polio would not be an issue.
Okay. How many cases of diphtheria have there been in the last 10 years in the United States?
It's very rare or absent.
All right. Less than 5, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Isn't that true for most of the diseases, except for maybe pertussis, right?
Well, pertussis, HIV, hepatitis, those are diseases that are still common.
Okay, so if we excluded
mumps, yeah.
Go ahead. Mumps, pertussis. Okay. So since this is retrospective, we would know where those outbreaks are, right? Because they're very carefully tracked by the CDC, correct?
Yes.
Since we know where those outbreaks are, that could be actually probably pretty easily controlled for as well, correct?
In principle, yes.
Okay, so can you name me a co-founder that would be difficult to control for in the study?
Well, at the moment, I can't think of any other that would be material, although I think one would have to look at genetic issues and the health of other members in the family and so forth. But again, I am not saying that such a study is impossible. I'm just pointing out that it would be a very difficult study to do, and the conclusions that you could draw from the study might be very limited.
I'm going to hand you what's been marked Plaintiff's Exhibit 24. You'll see that it involves looking at total health outcomes between vaccinated and unvaccinated homeschool children.
Yes.
Go down to where it says allergic rhinitis. What is that?
Well, it's essentially runny nose because of allergy.
Okay. Do you see that it says that the vaccinated children were 30 times as likely to have allergic rhinitis?
Yes, I see that number.
Do you see that it says that vaccinated children were 3.9 times as likely to have allergies?
Yes.
4.2 times as likely to have ADHD?
Yes.
4.2 times as likely to have autism spectrum disorder?
Yes.
2.9 times as likely to have eczema?
Mm-hmm.
5.2 times as likely to have learning disability?
Yes.
3.7 times as likely to have neurodevelopment disorder?
Yes.
And 2.4 times as likely to have any chronic condition?
Yes.
Okay. Wouldn't you like to see a larger scale study that refuted these claims?
It would be ideal, yes. It would certainly be important to repeat the study.
So it at least calls for further similar studies, hopefully, to either confirm or disprove the findings in the study, correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, I would agree.